If you have fever and cough or sore throat, stay.
Nor bend for your king. Never.
The widely popular and blockbuster Planet of the Apes series sets up an apocalyptic world where the human species is gravely endangered and a highly evolved apes take over. Of course, there is a lot of creative liberty in the narrative, and the Simian Flu is a virus that is used to explain the major deviations between the series and the real world. Every apocalyptic movie requires a catalyst, and for the Planet of the Apes series, it is this deadly virus, which has a rather captivating backstory. In this video, we will explore everything there is to know about the Simian Flu and how it shapes the narrative of the movie series. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you, and let's begin.
Bridge. A 6-hour standoff with police ended with the apes disappearing into mere woods.
Origins of the Simian Flu explored. What was the intended purpose of the virus? As bizarre and ironic as it may sound, a virus that wiped out a majority of humanity and overthrew humans from the top of the food chain was actually created with a noble intention. Will Rodman was a brilliant scientist who worked for Gen-Sys biotech and developed the first version of the virus known as ALZ-112. He intended to use this ALZ-112 as a serum that could be injected into humans and cure them of the deadly Alzheimer's disease. Rodney's own father suffered from dementia, and this might have inspired the scientists to experiment on a potential cure. ALZ-112 was tested on primates in the laboratory, and one of the test subjects, a chimpanzee named Bright Eyes, showed signs of heightened intelligence. However, the chimpanzee went berserk and believed that her new child would be threatened by those at the research facility. She was executed by the security officers, and the other chimpanzee test subjects were euthanized. Will Rodman felt guilty for Bright Eyes' condition, and he adopted her baby chimpanzee and named him Caesar. Meanwhile, after ALZ-112 was administered to Rodman's father as well, his dementia was cured temporarily, but later his immune system fought against the virus and he fell sick again. Overall, the first edition of the Simian Flu, aka ALZ-112, caused heightened intelligence among the apes, but failed to work for the humans. Even Caesar, the adopted chimpanzee, showed signs of the intelligence possessed by his mother, and this seemed to be the first step to a major development for the species. In order to enhance the effects of ALZ-112 and rule out the failure to work in humans, Rodman came up with a new version of the virus called ALZ-113, which was in a gaseous form. This seemed to provide the apes with a greater sense of intelligence, and when Rodman tried to test the virus on his father, the old man refused and died the following day. By the time Rodman rejoined work, he discovered that the Gen-Sys Corporation had been quite reckless with its newly invented ALZ-113. They tested this on the other chimpanzees at the facility, and the head of the organization, Stephen Jacobs, completely ignored the warnings of Will Rodman on the potentially deadly consequences of random testing of this virus. Jacobs was more focused on maximizing the profits for the organization by selling the ALZ-113. In the process, one of the chimpanzee handlers, Robert Franklin, was infected after his mask was knocked off by one of the test subjects. He wanted to let Will Rodman know about the lethal nature of the virus, but when he went to Rodman's house, the scientist wasn't home. One of his neighbors, an ill-tempered pilot named Douglas Hunsaker, startled Franklin, who accidentally sneezed on him, and this marked the beginning of the end. It was about to set off an uncontrollable chain reaction that would spread the virus to the point that led humanity to an apocalypse. The pilot was now infected with the virus, and Robert Franklin died shortly, bleeding from his nose, mouth, eyes, and ears.
Doc!
Who the hell are you?
How did the virus spread, and what were the devastating effects on humanity? By now, the impact of the enhanced intelligence among the apes started to show the first impacts. Caesar and the other intelligent apes escaped into the Muir Woods, and the ape rebellion seemed to have started off. Gen-Sys tried their best to cover up their involvement, but the far-reaching consequences were far from over. Douglas Hunsaker, the infected pilot, was about to board his flight at San Francisco International Airport when he noticed some bleeding from his nose, which was one of the symptoms of the ALZ-113 virus. However, he chose to ignore his condition and flew the aircraft, thus spreading the virus among the passengers on board, bound for Paris. There couldn't have been a worse carrier of a virus than an airline pilot who visited almost every continent, and soon Hunsaker turned out to be instrumental in infecting regions in Europe, Asia, Africa, and even Alaska. After returning to the United States, Hunsaker succumbed to the virus, but by now the world was in the grips of a deadly virus that threatened the very human existence. The WHO took notice of the outbreak, and there were numerous cases of patients showing symptoms of the ALZ-113 infection. The hospitals soon became overwhelmed with an uncontrollable number of infected, and plans to quarantine those with hemorrhagic fever, cold, and sore throat that did not work. The media dubbed the ALZ-113 as the Simian Flu, and soon the failure to control the outbreak led to stricter containment methods. Proper quarantine protocols were followed, from wearing facial protection to staying away from the infected individuals, but a cure still wasn't in sight. Within a span of just 6 to 8 months, over 150 million humans died from the infection, and even the survivors were not exactly faced with a better world as the society showed signs of collapsing. How did a virus fatal for humans prove to be a gift for the apes? It is quite ironic that the virus created for the betterment of the human species turned out to spell disaster for the humans. Instead, it was a blessing for the apes, who turned out to be much more intelligent and enhanced. It even increased their physical abilities to some extent, which led to the final takeover of the planet by the previously downtrodden species. The reason behind this is hidden in the levels of immunity in humans and apes. The humans have a much weaker immunity, which made them susceptible to the virus and caused mass death in the earlier stages of the infection. On the other hand, the basic intent of the virus was to generate cells in the brain, and it worked wonders for the apes. Their stronger immunity meant that the apes did not have to suffer the side effects of the Simian Flu, and they used it to their advantage and developed as a species capable of ruling the world. The enhanced features of the apes could also be transferred to their offspring, and this meant that the future generations of apes would keep being smarter and more developed than before. However, they also inherited certain human traits such as manipulation, politics, and revolution. What were the social consequences of this deadly outbreak? One of the first victims in every apocalyptic scenario is a societal structure and law, and this one was no exception. The chaos, hysteria, and panic among the public reached uncontrollable levels, and the civilian order and regard for laws seemed to have collapsed violently. Anarchy and lawlessness could be observed everywhere, and when the general public learned about the reality behind the virus outbreak, rioting mobs broke into zoos and wildlife parks to slaughter the apes. Their anger was completely misplaced, and somehow the entire blame for the Simian Flu had been shifted to all kinds of apes and monkeys. Aside from the ape-hating tendencies, there were also cases of mass rioting and looting, and the National Guard and FEMA had to intervene. Amidst this crisis, there arose another menace: the nihilistic Alpha Omega terrorist group that came up with a solution to kill anyone who was infected in order to get rid of the infection. This led to violent attacks all over the world, and other similar extremist groups also started emerging. Hospitals were firebombed, and government establishments were ransacked. As the lawlessness seemed to get out of hand, the Alpha Omega organization saw the virus as a way to purify the human race, and they claimed that anyone who was infected needed to be eliminated because humanity had to be purged. Greater dangers to the society and human existence came from man-made disasters, such as the meltdown of nuclear power plants after their reactors were destroyed from overheating. Meanwhile, the violence took the shape of ethnic cleansing in several parts of the world, such as Africa and former Yugoslavia. China brought about a brutal crackdown where the rebelling ethnic minorities were eliminated, and similar religious conflicts could be seen in the Middle East, where Muslims and Christians clashed with each other. In India, there were a few fanatical groups who misunderstood the implications of chemical spills in the rivers and saw them as a sign of religious salvation. They began to self-immolate in these waters, and overall the Simian Flu caused irreparable damage to the world that made the chances of any recovery impossible. Did a new strain of the Simian Flu turn humans feral and primitive? Whatever doesn't kill you doesn't necessarily make you stronger, and the survivors of the Simian Flu found out about this the hard way. Roughly 2 years into the long-drawn conflict between the humans and the apes, an incredible evolution was observed in the structures of the human brain, which led to the infected losing their speech capabilities. Even the intelligence of the infected individuals were significantly reduced, and they turned into a much more primitive version of themselves. This also turned humans a lot more violent and feral than they would otherwise be. The new mutation was shockingly contagious, and it could spread even from the belongings of the infected. On the other hand, the new strain of the Simian Flu made the apes more intelligent and evolved, and this further pushed the humans to a disadvantageous point against an uprising of the disgruntled apes. It is also important to note that this new strain was actually instrumental in giving rise to the idea of eliminating the infected ones in order to preserve and protect the human race. What was the aftermath of the Simian Flu outbreak? The long-term impact of the outbreak proved to be even more dangerous than the immediate chaos and violence. Just 5 years into the deadly pandemic, the human population had shrunk to half, and there were still no signs of a cure. The United Nations and NATO tried to contain the situation using their peacekeeping forces, but the anarchy couldn't be averted. Martial law became the rule of the land for a majority of nations, and finally, after every effort to bring in order failed, it was declared in a public message that all government functions and activities were to be suspended indefinitely. It was the final nail in the coffin of a civilization collapsing, and it remained the same even 10 years into the outbreak. The surviving humans now resided in small, isolated groups across the world. Everything was in ruins, and the survivors simply took shelter in the decimated cities and counted on their immunity for survival. Meanwhile, they had to deal with the genetically evolved superior apes who had their own colonies in this post-apocalyptic world. After the events of Rise of the Planet of the Apes, 99% of humanity was killed off because of the uncontrollable and fatal Simian Flu, and the remaining 1% were immune to the outbreak and the last of the helpless survivors. However, this still wasn't a chance to rebuild the human civilization because the feral strain that we spoke about turned out to be a side effect that these survivors had to deal with. All in all, humanity had been reduced to a lowly species and was simply no longer on the top of the food chain. In fact, in the recently released Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, humans are not significant at all, and we see the true outcome of the Simian Flu as the planet is completely overrun by the apes as the supreme species. How did the outbreak cause a rift between humans and the apes? One thing that has been quite evident in the Planet of the Apes series, it is the real monstrous nature of humanity. Before the Simian Flu became a threat for the humans, there were various cruel methods of experimentation carried out on apes. The apes suffered and were slaughtered at will, and finally the outbreak seemed to have brought about a power balance. After the violent aftermath, the surviving humans went underground and the enhanced apes took over the power. As the new rulers of the planet, the apes had enough reasons to act for vengeance, and there were different personalities among the apes who viewed this differently. Over the 4 movies in the series, some have been sympathetic to the human cause, while some others have been ruthless and brutal about it. However, the underlying statement still remains that the Simian Flu became the crucial cog in the human-ape conflict and even turned out to be the decisive factor. Marvel's verdict: fiction became a reality for humanity in the recent past. The exact extent of the damage that can be caused by the apocalyptic situations portrayed in fictional movies is often left to the imagination. However, the COVID outbreak in the recent past came as a haunting reminder of how an outbreak as deadly as the Simian Flu can look like in the real world. Of course, the impact wasn't as deadlier as the one we see in the Planet of the Apes movies, and humanity was quick to find a cure, but it still served as a grim reminder of how things can take an ugly turn at any moment with such lethal viruses. The concept of the Simian Flu in the Planet of the Apes franchise is quite intriguing, and the detailed backstory only gets more elaborate in subsequent movies. We expect more inputs on the same in the upcoming movies in the franchise, and the lore deserves to be explored further for the sake of the story. We'd love to hear your opinion on the Simian Flu in the Planet of the Apes movie series in the comments below. Also, tell us if you think that such a virus can actually manifest itself in the real world and threaten humanity. As always, if you like our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.
Strong.